I got a question for you.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
What? Because
42.
you've read Hegel and Heidegger, so we've circled this issue a lot, where it's like, what is what is the Heideggerian point that Hegel doesn't get? Is it that Hegel gets everything that Heidegger's saying? Is Heidegger not really saying anything different? Is it more just like, okay, like it's just a perspectival shift? Is that really it?
I think that's a great question. Um, I am extremely partial to reading Heidegger and the late Heidegger in light of Thomas Wynn's reading, of which is going to put a whole lot of emphasis on being is precisely that of which comes forth historically situated, and we should let it come forth as such, as opposed to trying to get through that historical interpretive iteration, if you will. Because when we try to get through that, we end up in, this kind of eternal regression of everything kind of falling apart, and that there is a certain radical encounter that Heidegger wants us to actually let being come forth as, and that we then encounter. If you accept my reading of Hegel as dealing with the problem of presuppositionalist philosophy by introducing intersuppositional philosophy, which is that no, we cannot base philosophy on presuppositions. It's actually based when you understand that presuppositions are not possible, then you have to base it on the surprise of the encounter of limit. And limit is what gives rise to actually what philosophy needs to think about. If you make that move, then there is absolutely very significant overlap between Heidegger and Hegel. I am obviously extremely partial to that take. I think it is justified because I think the way that Heidegger deals with the problem of way that Hegel is dealing with the problem of presuppositionalist philosophy and seemingly the impossibility is basing it on the encounter of limit and making the encounter of limit itself as a necessary basis of philosophy. Because if you ask what is, because you could say, the great question of philosophy, you could say, in some regard, and Chetan, Michelle, wonderful to have you, is the question of necessity. Not merely probability, but what is kind of necessary. And Max has also emphasized that, right? And if you say freedom, well, you could question that. And where do you get that from? Aren't you just assuming it? Like, how do you avoid assumption, right? In my opinion, Hegel makes the necessity the encounter of limit itself. And I think that is, he also tries to justify basing philosophy on the encounter of limitation through the phenomenology. And then the phenomenology is making way, like the phenomenology in a very real sense is kind of to be cast aside. Not really cast aside, but it's kind of like beside the point. Okay, now that we've shown spirit moving through history in a manner where it comes to know itself according to encounters with limit, now we can ask, what must the conditions of possibility be in order for this to be such? What kind of philosophy would develop if it was based on limitation? Ah, the beautiful Teton. And if that's the case, then there is absolutely something about Heidegger and Hegel that go together. And if one wants to say that Hegel predicted everything that was going to be in Heidegger, is there a difference? And this I don't. This is there a difference between encountering limit and letting being be? Is being in the driver's seat for Heidegger, where the encounter of the subject is in the driver's seat for Hegel? Like, is there a difference between those different things? I think there is profound overlap, very profound overlap. But I would be curious, any response to what I'm saying or any more you want to say about the question?
I wa- I could talk about it in that language, but I think honestly, I honestly think it's for me, I can penetrate the answer or just that this impasse in a more in a deeper way if I use the story analogy. Like,
But I think
hey,
that's actually appropriate. Because I guess I want it not to jump in again. There
no,
is
please,
a
please.
way in which you could almost, now this is getting, again, anything I say I do not, can be deconstructed as one would like. There is a very interesting way in which what Hegel is doing in the phenomenology, which I do think is from the movement of Geist or spirit or mind, or how knowledge comes to know itself and develop as itself. And of course, you can break the phenomenology into two sections, at the point of reason, to religion, to absolute knowing, and then, of course, consciousness, self consciousness. Um, there is a way in which being in time based on Dasein is making a sort of movement that is kind of similar to the phenomenology, but one I almost want to say is based more trying on the ground level of the experience, the existential experience of no one in particular, per se. Whereas in Hegel, we're looking at it from more of a historical lens. Like, the spirit is moving more from an individual knowing of consciousness of itself to then a historical movement that is in play, right? In Heidegger, and there's a way in which, of course, being in time is setting the stage, right, for the middle Heidegger and the later Heidegger. And well, that's a very similar thing to Hegel setting the stage for the science of logic with the phenomenology of spirit. There's a certain setting of the stage, but from different starting points, from dispositions. So then, of course, it can be different stories, right? Like you're talking in terms of different ways by which to base story. But I interrupted you, Mr. Luber.
No, 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 that was great. Like Hegel's dialectic seems to be the way a story internally moves, which which is isomorphic to basically the theme of the story in terms of how the theme moves within the story. Because they're part of the same substance, they're part of the same phenomena. Um, but the thing that we've talked about privately is if you really focus on the dialectic of the story, there's a chance you might not be able to articulate its theme well,
Right.
like to a significant degree. Whereas if you come at it too thematic, too top down in the story, you might miss some of the dialectical movement within the story, and therefore you might withdraw like while watching the story because you're coming at it too top down, let's
Right.
say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess I guess there's an issue with seeing them as like separate ways of approaching the same thing.
Sure.
There might be an issue with that. And I think um what Heidegger was just doing was he was basically to me, he was giving some kind of theology to the dialectics. Now, that's a very loaded thing to say because I think Hegel's dialectics is like anti-theology in its like traditional sense of the word. But if we were to look at theology in terms of like that which bonds the phenomena, a different approach, then we're looking at like what's bonding the actual dialectics itself. Like, what about being there is affording us to process it dialectically. And that's when Dasein's very helpful because we understand that any kind of dialectical movement is always already based in some form of logic of Dasein. There, there's something to the passivity in what you're saying, where um, the dialectical movement is always already um, moving in that particular direction because it has some kind of particular relationship, that particular relationship to Dasein. So when we talk about like withdrawal, like the events or these kind of things, it's like after the event, then there's this dialectical unfolding. Um, but to really understand the dialectical unfolding, you have to let beings just be and then account for that being as some kind of dialectical process. Um, the problem is, whenever I say that to Hegelians, it sounds like you're saying something that's outside the dialectics. Like if you're a Hegelian that sees dialectics as the end all be all, that everything is just a dialectical deadlock, then the concept of like Dasein being in a certain sense prior to that that dialectical deadlock seems to like there's an impasse there, because if Dasein is always already present in every dialectical deadlock, then how we understand Dasein per se isn't necessarily contingent on that particular dialectical deadlock that's being presented in any kind of dialectic. Sorry for saying dialectic so much, but um, so I just think there's like a logic that I think that is compatible with both, that they're both dialectic, but it's just um um I guess I get confused. Like this is the part where I get confused right here, where it's like, is Dasein actually dialectical or not? Because basically the Heidegger move to me is like, okay, like if you really think about Heidegger, then you get to like beauty and like things that like Geopedia and like that kind of stuff. But that suggests that there is something that's not dialectical. So that's like the impasse, because um, anything that's always already present, that's not presented in a dialectical format, ergo isn't dialectical. It can be construed and looked at dialectically, but at the same time, if you're saying that it doesn't have to be looked at dialectically, then it's not inherently dialectical. That we humans are just making it dialectical for us to think through it. So like that's really the tension there. Now, like, yeah, I guess I'll just say one more thing. If every subject is dialectical, and then if you have some kind of like proto subject, which is something like theme, something like Dasein, where it's in a state of becoming, but that's like the fixed constraint within that state of becoming. Um, is that any different? Is that just, are you just like, are we just doing word salad there, where it's like, is there really a difference between proto subject and subject? If they're both just dialectical, if everything's just dialectical, um, how do you make the distinctions essentially?
Right.
And I think like something like Dasein helps actually ground a way to make distinctions, because each dialectic seems to have a different relationship to Dasein, essentially. So yeah, I'll pass it off.
No, I think you've said a lot that is very, very important. So, and then I'll give it to Dan. So there's a few things. So first, you have a problem with Hegel. So, these are just my thoughts, and I give them no authority in any way whatsoever, and they could be entirely wrong, but I will give my thoughts. So you have this problem in Hegel of, how do I, Daniel Garner, get into Hegel? Like enter Hegel. Like how do I enter what Hegel is doing? And I would argue that is actually, for most of the history of philosophy since Hegel, been a very significant problem. One of the reasons why Hegel has now come back is because a way that the genius of Zizek, in my opinion, was figuring out that psychoanalysis was a way to get Daniel L. Garner into Hegel, right? But for most of history, before Zizek, getting me into Hegel was quite difficult to see myself in it, right? One could look at Heidegger as picking up on that problem, as providing a way to enter into, as Daniel L. Garner, if presented as Dasein versus just the, that subject, that form of the subject, is a way to actually get into Hegel's logic when nothing was really on offer for that, right? Because also, there's an issue in Hegel that I think points to this, where when we say everything is dialectical, yeah, but the problem is I'm an understanding naturally. I don't actually experience dialectics. Like reality does not present itself to me naturally as dialectical. I have to know better, right? I experience naturally AA, right? So there's this way that even if there is always already dialectics, I don't experience them. So I have a problem. I actually have to come to a realization of reason, which in a sense, reason is simply understanding itself. And that meta move, if you will, actually creates the AB, right? So Hegel goes about showing understanding coming to reason historically by the movement of history, right? Because history is like, I mean, if you look at history, it's pretty obvious that, there's a dialectical movement that occurs, right? And if history does this, then once you get to the science of logic, it's the question of, okay, what would actually be a logic that is sublating Aristotle that would actually capture this movement that we are observing in history? It's a kind of almost scientific, a rigorous study of how we've seen spirit, mind, if you want to use that language, develop through time. And if that is so, what must the nature of being be like, right? Okay, well, if I come to understand on that kind of macro level how things are, how do I as an individual enter into that logic? And what would that exactly mean for me? Well, psychoanalysis becomes a very powerful way by which to get into that, right? Like you start to see, actually, if we pay attention to what psychoanalysis finds for the human being, we actually do see a logic that is like the science of logic in operation. Okay. That becomes a kind of access point by which we can then think the science of logic, as opposed to the science of logic more being stuck on a certain movement of history that is in operation, that is occurring. And then history becomes the door. And, you mentioned teleology. Like, for me, also, too, there's a lot in where, when I read the philosophy of right, the movement, we must do what we think is good. Like, we must do what we think is good. Because here's another way I would put this. I also think about the Heidegger, in a way, we can think of the problem of encountering limit after the nuclear bomb. And I know this sounds very odd, but let me explain what I mean by this. In Hegel, because we have to pursue what is right, and the more you move to Geist, you get a kind of collective intelligence that, by definition, following Augustine, you must do the right. It's the problem of the right in Hegel, right? Like, you're always going to be doing the quote-unquote right? Well, the problem is the right always passes over into otherness. But you can't stop seeking the right because you know that. You nevertheless have to continue to be toward what you think is the best thing to do. Me knowing that what I think is best to do will eventually unveil its shortcomings doesn't mean I stop doing it. Well, what are you going to do now? They're wrong? Of course not. You're going to still do what you think is right, even if you know it passes over into otherness. Oh, and the way it passes over into otherness, you cannot know until you get there, right? So there's a way in which you're kind of set up to necessarily work through history to a point where you encounter a surprising limit, and then you go on from there. So you always have this kind of necessary failure that then leads to the encounter of limits that then is another way by which Geist comes to know itself, etc., so forth, right? And there's a certain inevitability to this process in Hegel's day, actually, right? Because, even if a million people die, the world keeps going, and eventually you learn and you, etc., go, so forth, right? So there's a kind of inevitability. It is perhaps not a teleology, but it does have a certain directionality to it, which is you must do what you think is right, even to the point where it encounters limits, thus unveils the way that you need to change, and you go from there, right? And this is the necessary way that there is a certain development that occurs in thought. And of course, then Hegel, and I guess you could overlap this with the certain letting, is the reconciling that Hegel puts on this process. There's a certain reconciling yourself to this process because the owl of Nineveh flies at dusk, right? It's already flown. So there's a certain reconciling, right? And there's a certain reconciliation to history necessarily being the way that unveils the direction of thought or what thought needs to think, right? But then the nuclear bomb is made and we could all die. Or what if you get AI and we forget everything, right? Well, suddenly the inevitability of the process and learning from the encounter of limits is not so much given, actually. Oh, and what if you actually have different ideas of the good under global pluralism? What if you have like an inability for actually people to all agree on what exactly it is you should reconcile yourself to, right? Well, then you might have to go actually to get the very same lessons of Hegel that is going to move actually more to the level of the subject, which I would say Heidegger is in the direction of. And of course, Lacan and Heidegger, well, the early Lacan is, very much in Heidegger. And actually the early Zizek is very much into Heidegger. And both of them kind of split later on for different reasons. But there is a certain idea of Heidegger perhaps offering a door by which we can more, as Daniel Ergoner, actually participate in this movement of coming of thought thinking itself and developing according to its own encounters of limit that is not so much based on a historical, because you have the death of the grand narrative as well. Like there's a certain skepticism of the grand narrative now. Well, does that mean you throw out Hegel? Does that mean you throw out Geist? Well, a lot of people did. A ton of people did. A ton of people threw it out, right? And in throwing it out, even if there is a certain repetition that is occurring in Heidegger, by doing it on a different level, on a different scale, it actually doesn't get thrown out with the critique against grand narrative or the critique of this Enlightenment idea of actually learning from the movement of history itself. Like there is a certain progressivism to Hegel. Right now, I think it's a contingent progressive because if there's a future, things are going to be better, but there's no guarantee that there's a future. But nevertheless, the appetite for that sort of thing goes out the window, right? Okay, well, does that mean you throw out Hegel then? Because in one way, it would seem like you do. No, you need to figure out a way to enter into that logic from a different direction, from, well, the level of the subject, ultimately. Psychoanalysis does that. I think Heidegger is gesturing toward that. And that also becomes incredibly necessary if the movement of history itself no longer guarantees the spirit coming to encounter its own limit and then learning from it, because actually we nuke ourselves and everything's over, right? Or we don't agree on the interpretation, or we're so splintered apart we actually can't apprehend the movement of history in what is encountering, right? So there's a certain almost decentralization of that effort to individuals that occur, that I think can absolutely be located in and worked with Hegel. But the question is, what then is the justification of the work of, say, a Heidegger? Or why is it that psychoanalysis being combined with Hegel seems to make such a powerful combination? I think it is because of those problems that we are listing out. That's one way I think about it. I'd be curious if you have any more thoughts on that, Mr. Luber, but I will.
Presuppositionalist philosophy means that they're what I was just saying was Dasein could be seen as a presupposition. So like that goes against like Hegel's presuppositionalist philosophy, and then from a psychoanalytic perspective, it's that is a fantasy. That's not actually something that essentially grounds something, because I mean the tricky thing with Hegel, I mean with Heidegger, is that he rejects basically, like he agrees that there's like a gap, essentially, that there's a void at the center, that there's not like some God that's pulling all the strings. Like he rejects that, but yet he's able to construct Dasein in a way where it's almost the positive charge that comes out of that hole, the emptiness at the center of the cosmos, so to speak.
Not to jump in.
Yeah, please.
To me, I guess this is the key question. If I say you have to start in understanding, because I associate Dasein with understanding, where you think in terms of understanding to move through, or as Dasein to arrive and encounter the necessity of reason, if you grant me the Hegelian terminology. Is Dasein a presupposition, or is it an intersupposition in the encounter of understanding with its own limits? Like that to me is the key, because yes, there's a sense in which you can say, oh, Dasein is a presupposition. But actually, it turns out once you work through Dasein that it is actually more of an intersuppositional that is based on the fact that we have to start in understanding and move to reason, because if we start in reason, we couldn't understand and it would overwhelm us. I start in understanding. I start in picture thought. I start in A is A. I must, or else I would go psychotic, right? I would go nuts. And this is where psychoanalysis starts to come in. You can't start with the real. You require the symbolic. You require the imaginary, or you'll be overwhelmed. Is that a presupposition? Or is it a reality of finitude with the infinite, if you will? Is that a reality of the map with the territory? Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir, right? Like, is the fact that the map that you automatically have to form a map or the territory overwhelms you? Is that a presupposition or something that happens just like that and is actually an encounter with the territory, right? Because if it's an encounter and Dasein is a framing for that reality to work through to understand that you're always in a dialectical loop, always already with the infinite, then it seems as if Dasein is presuppositional, but actually it is intersuppositional. And that to me is very important because that's when you start to say, oh, Dasein, because you could say it's like if you have this idea of a proto subject, well, in a sense, it's proto in the sense that it's not the fullness of the subject as a realization of AB, but at the same time, that failure is actually necessary, or you'd be overwhelmed. You wouldn't function. So in what? So it's well, this is where, of course, in my bias and with Mr. Jockin here, of course, there's a certain lack that has to be tarried with. Dang it. And Dasein arises as a way by which I, Daniel Ergoner, can get at the lack. And is that is lack presuppositional? No, it is intersuppositional. Lack is an intersupposition. Cheaton, thank you for being here, sir. But it seems presuppositional simply because it is hard to put into language intersupposition. The moment I say we'll start with Dasein, I go, presupposition. Well, if along the movement of Dasein you actually are unveiled that it was intersuppositional, that retrospectively turns around to make you realize that it wasn't presuppositional at the start. It only seemed that way on this side of understanding. Mr. Luber.
Like this is Jockin that you came in. This is like super relevant to what me, you, and Javier have been talking about. I started the question basically where we were at talking essentially. The problem is that, but I'm part of the problem in the way I'm saying that it's a problematic. You could then have a meta dialectic that's strictly on the time axis that applies to all possible dialectics that are involved in just basically space. So like how I'm thinking about it is like with like people might not understand what I'm saying, but like bounce and distance is applicable to all possible story dialectical movements. Like it's how you play with the dialectical movements, no matter what those dialectical movements are. And then if that's the case, then you're basically saying there's a meta language. Which if you're saying there's a meta language, then you're saying that there's something other. There is a big other, which is exactly what the people that take these dialectical accounts seriously say there can't be a big other in order for there to be dialectics in the first place.
Right? Am I making sense?
Yeah, you are. Now, and then Daniel C., you're a saint. And Clayton, the meta language is emergent. So here's the issue. Hegel's philosophy is on the radical movement of finitude. So this is the question. Is finitude presupposition or intersupposition? Like, is finitude a presupposition or just the necessary precondition to even ask the question of presuppositions, right? So all Hegel wants is for you to say we're finite, that there is limit, okay? That's enough then to actually, and then the question is the following. If I say we must operate as finite, is that a meta language? Or is that the language of the conditions of possibility, right? Like, that's a subtle difference. Like, because Hegel would be like, nah, none of this is a meta language. This is all a description of the movement of finitude, of which, if it moves this way, is not, and we see it in history, and we see it in the individual, then it is not meta, it is more actually emergent, as Clayton is putting forth. It is actually how finitude is in its very movement, right? And so, in that sense, dialectics, of which critically dialectics is the movement of finitude. It's not merely the Socratic method of thinking, for example. It certainly can lend itself in that direction, but it is the fact that everything passes into otherness, which basically means everything finite becomes something else through time. That's why time is more primary than space. Everything is kind of unfolding, right? So dialectics is not so much, here's the key. Dialectics is not so much the way you think about reality. It's what you observe reality doing. And thus you take that observation as a way of understanding reality. Things pass into otherness. Maps find out they're not the territory and adjust. They pass into a different map. Everything is moving. So dialectics is not merely a way of thinking in the sense of I just decide one day, hey, I'm going to think dialectically, and I choose that instead of analytical philosophy. What Hegel wants to show is that no, things are dialectical, and therefore, actually, in thinking dialectically, we're actually just, in a way, thinking empirically. For him, it's phenomenology, right? Like, it seems like a method. That's the weird move, but actually, it's simply an acknowledgement of what things are, right? And then the argument he would like to make, as I understand it, is that is finitude. That is literally what finitude does. And if it's finitude, then it's not presupposition, it's the condition of the possibility of existing. Now, you could argue if you're God, it's different, right? Like the difference is God. So do you believe in God or not? And that then starts getting into some of the Hermetica stuff. But in what sense? So this Hegel certainly wants to say there is no meta language, that there is a language that you can use to describe finitude in all possible worlds. But in a weird way, he wants to argue it's a description of finitude in all possible worlds that isn't a meta language. It is what finitude does. And the argument would be that, of course, there are infinite possible ways that finitude can be expressed, but all of them are going to have to move like finitude. And this is where I get into stuff like the metageometry, where looking at it is a lack gestalt. I would argue that all possible worlds must be a Gödel gestalt, that there is no possible world of a non-Gödel gestalt. There could be God, but if we're talking a finite possible world, and maybe you could make that argument, well, maybe there's a possible world that is not finite, right? But this is where Hegel wants to argue that the finite and the infinite are two sides of the same coin, right? Perhaps you could argue that there could be a being that is not finite, and that would be God. But if you say a world as a term distinct from God, now we can get into all of that theological fun, then it will always in all possible worlds have a Gödel gestalt. And that means you could indeed have a language of all possible worlds, and this is where I want to talk about modal logic. You can have a meaningful language in all possible worlds based on finitude as opposed to a top-down meta language. But that is based on metageometry as opposed to something top-down. And then you could argue that Heidegger is getting to that realization through Dasein. Of which makes sense in a world that no longer necessarily believes in a hard progressive idea of history. There is more to be said, but I will pause and give it to the one and magnificent Daniel. Daniel, thank you for being here, sir, on this fine day.
Wow, I mean, we are in the woods. This is fantastic and really, really difficult. I want to, I guess, just offer some logs. So what, just this week actually, I really came to an insight around contradiction, understanding contradiction as essential to Hegel. And what I realized was I was invested in the idea of contradiction, and so I'm implicating dialectic as well in this idea. That it functions between two opposites. That a contradiction is two contradictory opposite things, or dialectic is a movement between two contradictory opposite things. What I realized was the mistake in that is that presupposes a substantial self-identity to the things that are opposite. So there are two things enough to be opposite. Whereas the idea in Hegel, as I take it, is that is ontological contradiction. So the dialectic, the opposition, if we say that, or the contradiction is internal to the thing, such that the thing is split, or it isn't even a thing. So the opposition is not like one to the other, or these things in tension, the thing itself is split. The thing is contradictory. That if and like I received my understanding of Heidegger through an old philosophy professor a number of years ago, so it's a distance. But that if the reading of Heidegger then substantializes being, then it's moving away from that insight from Hegel that being is contradictory, or that contradiction is primary. So like if it, and one of the I'm moving through Todd McGowan's book Emancipation after Hegel. It's been really helpful for me around these ideas, even though I've been circulating them for a while. So if we put some kind of like the being that Heidegger is talking about is somehow unknown or somehow mysterious, that would be a kind of an indication from the Hegelian side, as far as I take it, that something's awry, or something we positing a substantiality and we're hiding it in its unknowability. So like so the idea might be that being is too substantial in that sense. We've substantialized it too much. And it's not actually there. That's I think is the kind of the core idea that I've been with this week. Maybe I just say one thing about how I understand Dasein, like the beingness of something. And the way that I received it was largely through someone very steeped in ancient philosophy, specifically ancient Greek philosophy. So the being of a thing is like the work of something. What it is to be the thing is to be in the work of that thing, in the activity of that thing. And so for things in the world like a shoe, it has a particular work, so it functions, and it does this concealment that when it's doing its work, then we kind of forget it. Then when it breaks, then we realize, oh, there's the shoe, etc. The being of the person or of the human being is the being whose being is in question. So it like opens this, well, it opens something. But then if we because our activity is the self-referential in a way, the activity that is proper to us is to determine the activity that is proper to us. There's this openness that's difficult. If now like riffing, if putting those two together, Hegel and Heidegger, that still presupposes on the Heideggerian side some being that is proper to us, that it's our proper work to be doing. So we can achieve some kind of well-functioning, we can become substantial in our being by fulfilling that being. What I've been trying to wrap my head around in the Hegelian side is that even that is too much, because contradiction is ontological. Maybe the third and the last kind of piece would be the way in which Heidegger, I think, is still, or like this question of experience or observation, like how do we come to our knowledge? And this is now just trying to remember what Todd McGowan was saying. There's something this Hegel would be unpopular from the stream of philosophy that is phenomenology, because of its reliance on experience. So in this movement of philosophy, we can only come to probably post-Kant, like we have to construct our reason to information that we get from experience. Hegel, the idea is there that in order to recognize the reality of experience, in order to come to experience, you have to go through the concept, into the concept, and then back to experience, so that you can see it as contradictory, which is up, or that's not a popular phenomenologist move, because it's suggesting that there's something other than experience, the concept. Let me put it down there.
No, very well put. So for me, if you say like everything we know has to be through experience, that seems necessarily true, right? Like you would go, that's necessarily true. And Hegel would say the fact that that's necessarily true is actually what needs to be the basis of philosophy, that limitation itself, right? Like if you say everything we know comes from experience, of course, did you get that from experience? When did experience tell you that everything comes by experience, right? Or comes in through the sense organs, right? Where did you receive that, right? You would say, well, you know, it's all I've ever experienced. And it would be like, oh, well, what if that's simply because you are limited from experiencing otherwise? And actually, that's not big. That limit itself is what you should think, not actually the take on that limit or what that limit affords you, right? Like the weird thing is the move of inexperience. I don't experience limit. This is something that Hegel wants to emphasize. I don't experience limit. I experience everything. If I see a rock that I can't lift, then I'm not limited from knowing I can't lift that rock, actually. When you experience in limit that you get something wrong, well, then you're not limited because you know you're wrong, right? So you actually necessarily experience reality as if you are not limited in the experience itself. But Hegel would say, well, that actually is the limit, that you must necessarily experience things as limitless, and you can't experience it otherwise. The only way to actually know your limit is to encounter otherness, because I can't get in your head. And that's when I actually then come in contact with limit. And that's why the movement from self-consciousness to reason in the phenomenology is a huge deal, because that unveils, oh, wait, I actually can't encounter my limit. And that is what I'm limited from understanding. And that creates a tension, ergo contradiction, because the word contradiction is not a logical contradiction. It's more in German of a tension that all things exist in necessarily in being themselves. Hegel is not saying that reality is logical contradiction. It's the fact that everything is like an embryo. Everything has a development that is occurring. And any point of saying what the thing is runs the risk of leaving out the entirety of that thing precisely because you're finite, right? And that's where ultimately you have to reconcile yourself with being faithfully present in the process of that thing unfolding, right? Which is one thing before the nuclear bomb and something else after the nuclear bomb, which is one thing before your attention has been destroyed by, the algorithm, and another thing once your attention has been destroyed by the algorithm, right? That's the issue, is the very way of letting things be will actually be historically conditioned radically, right? And that poses a certain issue where something like psychoanalysis, or actually you have to then, in order to think what is being put forth, actually do have to think things like psychoanalysis or technology or medium studies, etc., so forth. I think so the facing of the other actually becomes very central here. Absolutely, contradiction is ontological. The contradiction, though, has a certain embryo structure to it, a certain opening up of different things. I think this is where then like on that idea that being would be too substantive, right? That there's not enough contradiction in it, right? The move that Wynne suggests the later Heidegger makes, that I actually think, and the argument of Wynne, and I'm quite partial to Wynne's work on this, the argument that Wynne would like to make on Heidegger is that although the middle period has a certain emphasis on annihilation, the later Heidegger has an idea that actually being comes forth in a manner that unveils tension. Like being gives it, so you made the point of the hammer, right? Like it is at hand and I use it, right? And you would say, oh, that's a mistake, actually. That's not actually what being is. There's a way in which the later Heidegger actually goes, no, being is that of which gives itself to be understood in a multitude of ways, right? Actually, seeing things according to instrumentality is actually not necessarily wrong, because being is that of which gives itself to be understood or to appear in different ways. And that appearance is actually part of being itself, right? But then, of course, that does suggest a certain tension, because being is that of which gives itself to then be, in a sense, misinterpreted. Being is that of which gives itself to be missed. But actually, the way it is missed actually generates a way of experiencing reality, right? And that starts to approach something like a tension. That starts to approach something like a contradiction. Is it a dialectical process? Well, if you're saying, if you have this notion that being actually is kind of embryonically developing through history to be experienced in different ways, then yes. And actually the letting is the incubation of that embryo, right? And so that actually then starts to kind of start seeing the things together. But there is a very interesting way in which, following Wynne, that the later Heidegger actually stops seeing the way that being is at hand as keeping us from being, but actually the giving, it is kind of the grace of being. Being gives itself to actually be misconstrued. It gives itself to actually be framed in different ways. Being gives itself to be at hand as a being that is not itself, right? Well, the reason why this, I think, can be overlaid with Hegel is because reason, in a sense, gives itself to be understood. It gives itself over to be experienced in terms of understanding. And that's the only way to reason, though. The only way to being is actually through the at-handness, the way that it is historically mediated, and that actually is participating in it. Likewise, understanding the experience of reality as more A is A. Because another way to put it is like, we simply cannot experience contradiction in a frame of time, right? We have to reside with it and let the process unfold and experience it, right? So we have to give ourselves over to it. Well, that's getting at something like letting, right? That's getting at something coming forth. And you could say the genius of Heidegger is working that on the level of everydayness and working it at the very experience of, picking up a hammer. Then, of course, which to me then becomes very useful, because if the argument that I like to make that the Gödel Gestalt is isomorphic and fractal, meaning any point of the Gestalt contains all the information of every other point of the Gestalt, then you should actually be able to have an experience of the Gödel Gestalt in the picking up of a hammer as you would in the movement of history, as you would actually through the French Revolution, as you would actually in the encounter with your neighbor and learning how to face them, right? Every single moment in history actually becomes an opportunity for a participation in actually the Gödel Gestalt, because every moment contains, like a hologram, all the information of every other point, right? And that actually taking what Heidegger is saying as a method or a way of life is actually very useful. I will pass it to anyone who wants to say anything. I think for me, again, the reason why this question of the meta law and how you can actually get something. So let me put the question of philosophy in this sense, like to say something very bold. The question of philosophy in terms of, I want to say, ontology, the study of being and the characteristics of being, etc., so forth, becomes the question of, can you speak of something that is true or that applies in all possible worlds without a meta law? Can you speak of something that is the case in all possible worlds without a meta law? Because that would be the only way to speak of necessity, which philosophy is always very interested in, without falling into top-down. Because the mistake that, so philosophy wants necessity without presupposition. It wants an earned necessity, which almost by definition seems impossible. But the way I would frame that is that of which would be the case in all possible worlds and yet not a meta law, right? And that's going to start getting into the structure of finitude itself, which for me is a Gödel Gestalt. I'll pause and throw it at Daniel. Daniel, please.
It's quite something to try and think these things. It's a wonderful opportunity. It's very strange, and there's a certain privilege to it. So let me just like, I want to, in some place in the book, McGowan wonders whether contradiction is the appropriate word. And so then he floats the idea of like a vitality. And just that possibility of difference really reshaped or reorientated me to the idea of contradiction. And then I was doing like some etymology, and then so you have contra, and then diction, like speech. So the speech act as the contra, as the contraring. Just like a side note, at least when I'm trying to think through ideas, being, non-being, contradiction, dialectics. Maybe this like a side note and a curiosity. Like I'm curious about the kind of gestures that people make when they're reading, or the repetitions that they go through, the articulations. Like, are you so what one? Like, what is one, and then so each. I'm digressing, but like trying to think the concept one, and then now I've said it 3 times, one. What does that mean about time? That like I'm trying to think about this idea of one. I've said it thrice, but to the another to the side, and now like very much in the weeds. I was also called. Bruce Eldon is very fond of this time-space knowledge with Tartang Tulku, a Tibetan dude, who wrote specifically for the Western context in which he was transplanted, and tried to remove all languaging that would be kind of inaccessible or from his cultural context. Looking at like a triad of time, space, and knowledge that unfold together in the space of openness. So his ontology is like an openness. It just struck me that I think like as much as we get, like how much of a difference do we not sometimes miss an opportunity by really taking this cross-cultural or comparative philosophy seriously, like letting it inform. We can get like very into the momentum of a specific, I would say the Western conversation. Maybe Western's an unhelpful category, especially if you're looking far back into the ancients. But back to this idea of contradiction, and that vitality might be a better word for it, or McGowan at least puts that word down. He says it's not appropriate. I'm forgetting the reasons why. And Daniel, you pointed to one way in which things that we observe or an experience can come to be contradictory, or we can come to think them as contradictory. I'm forgetting the exact way, but the way that I'm remembering is like each thing for it to be a something is to locate its end or its limit. You're using the language of limits and finitude. So it has a limit, it has an end, and that signals the very end of the thing, so something that it isn't, which means that the thing contradicts itself. But why? Because to be a thing, the assumption then is to be a thing is to be like a whole thing, or to be an unending thing, or self-identical thing. That would seem to be the assumption operating. But how do we come to the place where we recognize where's the concept functioning in that recognition? Or what is concept? What is a concept? What is concept in the Hegelian system? I'm remembering some like proximity with love, like the identity of identity and non-identity. Like it's this idea of the loss of a self-substantial, self-identical substance, and a split where the opposition is internal and endlessly orbiting the way to say that the thing itself is split. Okay, so I know I'm meandering a lot, and I'm always trying to like, I'm not sure exactly what I'm trying to do. Just trying to orbit the contradiction maybe, because, and again, this idea of vitality. I was also, before I read that piece, I was floating the idea maybe, and this is also coming from a different philosophical tradition, more Eastern, but like um uh I think it's called yeah universal egoity or something like this, just like the selfness, the unique selfness of each instance or each being, or maybe going too far off there. To what is it that my own being, I mean, maybe it's good that I'm just like, I'm trailing off here, but hopefully I've put like a couple of logs. Maybe I'm most curious around this idea of contradiction on the ontological basis, how we get that from experience, how conceptual mediation of experience brings us to the understanding of ontological contradiction, which returns us to experience, but to see experience to be contradictory, which prior to the conceptual mediation, we don't have access to. I think that's one of the key critiques of Hegel, is that the error that the phenomenologists fall into is that without the conceptual mediation, they're still operating under a fantasy of arriving at some full substantial immediacy of experience. Let me pass back there.
No, I think that's brilliantly put. There's a few things to be said, and Michael, wonderful to have you. There is a way in which the phenomenologist assumes that in the, Herschel has a mailbox at the front of the class. There's an assumption that there is a certain experience of the mailbox that will have the thing come forth as itself. It's more complicated than that, but Hegel suggests, what if the very relation of the subject with the thing, in a sense, always pushes the limit away? Like it always pushes that final immediacy away. Because it is time space, it is developing in the relation in what it actually is. So actually the phenomenologist is always pushing the goal away, in a sense, in the very act of doing phenomenology, right? Like it's the distinction I like to make with the truth is everything as the case, where the absolute is everything that is the case plus us, which changes what is the case, that changes us, that changes what is the case, and you get a kind of feedback loop. So you never arrive at the immediacy. But there is a weird way in which phenomenology actually can be an experience of that very problem that then you can ask about and wonder about, and that becomes the movement of the concept. You say, oh, well, that actually, the absolute is that very limitation. That is the absolute is that very limitation. And based on the absolute of limitation, can you actually arrive at a necessity that must be the case in all possible worlds without a meta law? Like that's the question. And that would be necessity, right? So for example, if that was true, well, let me say a few more things on the contradiction. So you also have the problem, like with the language of contradiction, which I agree, the word contradiction is actually a word being used in a world that believes in space-time that is pointing to time-space. I think you could make an argument that in a world that more accepts time-space, the word contradiction transforms into things like situation or metageometry or unfolding, right? Like the contradiction is inseparable from dialectic. Like the contradiction, when Hegel talks about contradiction, he's talking about dialectics. If contradiction, the ontological state of contradiction is the ontological status of dialectic, because the contradiction is the tension that is the unfolding, right? You make a certain distinction between contradiction as ontological and dialectic as more epistemological to kind of get at ultimately kind of how you're using the method to get at the ontology, but actually they converge as an ontoepistemology, because the ontological contradiction is in fact unveiled as itself in the dialectical movement, right? So that's where you get that weird move. So contradiction and dialectic are two sides of the same coin. Now, You can also argue that the emphasis on contradiction is perhaps needed in a world drunk on perfect systems, perfect presence, designing the perfect society where let's just emphasize freedom and that will take care of itself. Like there's a belief in principles that are able to address everything, right? And certainly the language of contradiction provides a certain linguistic rupture in people's thinking to make them go, well, if everything is contradiction, then actually I can't have a perfect system. I actually have to be a little more humble. Actually, I need to throw out the analytical project. There's a way in which Hegel is, I'm biased, I do believe that Hegel is basically forerunning Korbowski, Gödel, people like that. Certainly Planier. He is suggesting that actually logic has to be reformatted around the acceptance of the inability of full immediacy, right? And that would change economics. That would change society. That would change a lot. We still exist in a world that basically does not believe in black swans, does not believe in limits to knowledge, right? In a world that doesn't believe in black swans per se, you could argue that the language of contradiction has a certain use, right? That it has a certain sort of shock value to actually wake you out of your dogmatic slumber and belief in nudges and all that. Like it would wake you up out of that. But the problem is on the other side of that, you do get a certain confusion on, so is he saying that Aristotle is wrong? No, and you know, this also breaks, Luber left, but I was going to say more on the Heidegger-Hegel thing. He asked the question if everything that Heidegger does is already in Hegel. And this makes me ask the question of if everything Hegel does is already in Aristotle. And this makes me think of actually reading as a whole of history, because the reason why I say that is there is absolutely a sense in which everything is already in Hegel, but everything of Heidegger is already in Hegel, but you actually can't realize that without Heidegger, okay? Like, this is the weird move. That is the history of reading. Like, so for example, I would like to argue, that this happens with religious texts all the time, okay? This very interesting problem of reading. I would like to argue that there has always been an anti-Gnosticism in the bad Gnosticism, disembodiedness, that has always been present in the Abrahamic traditions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. It's always been there. But weirdly, there seems to have been the need of certain theologians and thinkers and historical movements to realize this thing that was always already there. That then will make it seem like you didn't need N.T. Wright, as example, or didn't need these new thinkers. It will make it seem as if they weren't needed because it was already in the text. But actually they were needed to see the thing that was already in the text, right? Like what I'm saying is that Heidegger is not already in Hegel unless there's a Heidegger. Like, unless there's a Heidegger to actually see it, right? And so when we play the game, this is what I'm getting at. When you play the game, and obviously there's a lot of things in Aristotle that it wasn't until Hegel that I could start to see, but it's in Aristotle, but Hegel doesn't. So there's always this thing, but then to actually bring out what is in Aristotle, you need the footnotes of Plato. Like, the footnotes of Plato help bring out Plato, right? And in that sense, if you would never get Plato without the footnotes, then in what sense can you say the footnotes are dispensable? Because I think that's what people are suggesting. If Heidegger is already in Hegel, then we don't need Heidegger. That's the dangerous move. When you start saying you don't need them. No, you can actually still need them even if they're already in. Because they bring out something that otherwise you would miss. But other people, this, again, if Luber is listening, this can get into the story stuff because other thinkers can help you get back into Aristotle or get back into Hume or whatever, that might be different thinkers for other people, right? Like Lacan can be how Zizek gets back into Hegel, but for someone else, it could be Heidegger. For someone else, it could be Michel Planier, right? That actually then in the realization of the always already, then you see how all of these books and all of these writers are actually a gestalt. And this is my point. The moment you start playing the game of saying that, we don't need Heidegger because it's already in Hegel, in a way, you're treating reality not as a gestalt. You're treating the future as not necessary for the understanding of the past and the present. Like, you see, you're splitting time apart. actually, into little boxes, and you could pull some of them out versus not, right? When actually all of it is actually necessary for the movement of thought that really, and again, this is the crazy Hegel move, the movement of thought is always trying to realize something that was always already the case. Like, if philosophy is not in the business of coming up with ideas that only apply to 2025. Philosophy is in the business of determining ideas that were actually always already latent somehow, right? Especially once you get to the deep ontological questions, right? Well, the weird thing is the suggestion is actually the entire movement of thought through history is necessary for the realization of the fullness of the beginning of thought. Like that, in that weird way, the footnotes of Hegel, of the footnotes of Plato, they're actually very much part of Plato. The footnotes of Hegel are very much part of Hegel. It is all a certain sort of movement. That is all part of it. But you don't get that when everyone has turf warfare and they're specialized and they've got their tenure and they want to defend their guy as the most important. You don't get that great conversation, which the current academic culture has destroyed, and everyone has to defend their person, as opposed to seeing them all as perhaps unfolding of the theme according to different stories, right? If I allude to Luber's work, the suggestion is that there is a theme in philosophy based on the necessity of the metageometry that then unfolds in different stories of different thinkers. And yes, they're all already latent in that metageometry, but each one of those stories has a place, right? Because it can bring some people to the quote-unquote great conversation. It can make some people reconcile to it who otherwise wouldn't have, and actually help them see things they otherwise wouldn't have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that I think for me, there's I have more notes, but I'll pass it to Jockin. If we take seriously Gödel Gestalt, then that should impact your theory of reading. It should impact your theory of reading. And I think that helps with this academic game that can be played where something is already in Hegel or already in something. Because let me put it this way. If you play the game of saying, well, it's already in Hegel, but we're actually saying that you need Heidegger to realize the thing that is already in Hegel, then you actually don't realize what's in Hegel. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, you need the thing to actually realize the latency. That will then retrospectively make it seem like you didn't need the thing. And so you're like, I'm an idiot. But actually, that's all forgetting the contradiction, if you will. But I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, it's good to have you, sir.
I mean, great points. I mean, this is fantastic. I'm like waving I'm gesturing. I'm like, of course. No, it's self-deception. It's the constant thing. It's like, oh, it's all figured out. But of course, you only realize it after Heidegger showed up. It's always that. It's the retro. The constant game the mind does to us all the time to say it already figured it out. It just felt the self-forgetting of the mind of what was prerequisite required in time to come to the conclusion that it thought was so obvious from the beginning. Now, actually, another note, and this builds from what I said last week about, and I got some pushback I felt from this point from the group, but I sat in and did some readings over the weekend. The human person, their quality of the soul by their heart to pick out phenomenon that is unique to them. That is the key quality. I say this meaning in the sense that, so when Heidegger reads Hegel, right, and picks out the qualities, this is the essential quality of the person. That in the phenomenon of experience, something picks out that everyone else saw. Everyone saw the same information was presented to everybody. Yet why did, and this is the Greek term from Aristotle, the bringing before the eyes. Why was the bringing before the eyes for Heidegger something that was absent from everybody else? And then once it was brought before the eyes, a new revelation was revealed. That was always there from the beginning. I'm bringing this up, so I mean, this note, I wrote my Substack recently about this, where when we talk about contradictions, or usually contradictions, there's one discussion that we've talked about the Hegelian mode. Usually the mode, from an Aristotelian point of view, is to say we're misunderstanding something. If we're running into a contradiction, we're lacking something. We're missing something from the understanding. I think constantly everyone thinks of consciousness, personhood, subjectivity. is of the mind. And by the way, greatest thinkers think nous. They think nous is what makes us human, right? Our intellect. Aristotle's point about the common sense, I wrote my substack about this, that there's a mode of consciousness that is not of mind, but of the heart. And that wasn't just, and by the way, this is not a metaphoric kind of play here. It is very essential biology of the heart, and I say this because I did some digging in. We actually use there's actually specific nerve centers called the internal cardiac nervous system. We have a nerve system in our heart. We actually do. It's an organic part of the body. And it's actually the resonance of the signals from the heart to the mind is an objective measurement of consciousness. This is one as we know this. So it's not the consciousness of the brain. Everyone thinks the brain is what the consciousness is. It's actually the resonant relationship of the heart to the mind, the cerebral basically brain versus your heart brain. And when I'm using that language, that was a little artistic what I just said. But the point is that this is what Aristotle says. It's actually the common sense that perceives time. It's perception of time, the origin of consciousness, and the apprehension of what's brought before the mind, brought before the eyes. So this is radical because no one, even Aristotelian accounts, no one buys. This is such a concept. This is ad hoc. This was an ad hoc cope of Aristotle. So actually, by the way, the game modern academics do is say, "Oh no, the old guys didn't get it." Right? Kant was doing this from a get-go. I think the very fact that, and by the way, I also said the reason why Kant said that was because no one bought the spirit argument, the model of spirit in Aristotle. Another area I completely dismissed. I don't blame them because it's really the limit of his thought. It's such a difficult area of Aristotle, but he does have it, and that's part of the experience because it's the spirit that comes through in the generation of the heart that generates life, right, in the organism. So it's actually it's maps on what Aristotle is doing. So that's why I'm not buying this Kant argument. It's ad hoc. But anyways, that's a tangent. I just bring this up in the sense of, so if we take this account seriously, the subjectivity of the person with their heart is actually the mode of the real substance of a person and their intellectual activity. Because by the way, Aristotle's language is actually really extreme. He says that the common sense within the heart is the lord of perception. It's very dramatic language here. I mean, so thus, this kind of tearing away of the mind, of the operation of the mind is where the soul is and where the person is and their totality is verified empirically, is actually found in the body. So actually, by the way, I wish Espacé was here because I think the therapeutic account where they're constantly yelling about, it's the body, it's the body. They're not wrong in this account on this exact point. Is that just a kind of fixation on dialectic operations of thought, that's what the person is, and that's what philosophy is about, is misunderstanding what is this process about. The human person with our heart has to encounter experience and draw forth by bringing before the eyes the real reality of the experience. Experience needs to be ensouled. It needs to be ensouled so that we can work with it. And that's what thought does all this great work in the imagination, right? The phantasms are processed, and then we work in the imagination to then process and synthesize it with the intellect. So it's actually a servant. It's actually not the master, it's the servant. So it completely reverses our orientation of the relationship of what it means to be a person. And I think especially in the kind of, since the greatest works of experience is reading philosophy, right? Other pieces of human works of art. Because that actually draws forth experience in a much more concentrated manner for us to work with in our operations of thought. I'll leave with that.
No, I think that's very well put. I'll give it to Daniel. On this idea of the essential bringing before the eyes, the certain heart. So there's also Hegel at the beginning of the phenomenology is very concerned about intuition, where people are using intuition to basically skip conceptual mediation, where they're saying, I feel something is true, therefore it is true, and he believes this is very dangerous, right? So then he wants to put thought through the conceptual journey that involves a certain realization of dialectics. But I would argue very, very, very much so that dialectics is ultimately for the sake of speculative reason. And speculative reason ultimately is tied into the realization of the absolute idea, which is tied to a certain sort of baptism or of intuition actually through dialectics, which then it's not that you're saying that everything then just goes into conceptual mediation, but you're actually going through conceptual mediation in order to ultimately, in a sense, let it go. That is going to, I think, start approaching, well, he doesn't have the language, but I mean, you're starting to look at news. You're starting to actually look at the whole point, in a way, of dialectical realization is to not get a cheap sort of apprehension of the reality, but to get an apprehension of which is actually not trying to remove a lack of understanding, but actually seeing that lack of understanding as the necessary precondition of an unfolding that ultimately then affords beauty and so on and so forth. I think also there's a weird move where once you say contradiction is essential, and you actually gain knowledge that contradiction is essential, then there's a way in which it is, you're making the limit of thought, because on that idea in Aristotle that a contradiction must be a lack of knowledge. Like if you think there's a contradiction, it means you don't know something, right? Well, there's a weird move and a suggestion of if you actually know that contradiction is essential, then contradiction actually is the movement of thought. It is not like the very fact you don't know everything, ergo there is a lack, a present absence, is actually part of ontology. It is part of reality itself. The fact you are limited in your knowledge is actually a necessary precondition for the development of knowledge. It is not something you want to remove and get rid of, because if you did that, the embryo would die. Nothing would develop anymore. That actually becomes what you want to think, because there's a resistance to this idea, oh, the contradiction is actually that which we ignore. We push it to the aside. Another, Kant's anomalies of and antinomies of reason, right? Hegel's like, no. Those are the revelations of reason, actually. Those are actually the revelation of how things actually are, if you take that seriously. And so then the limits of thought are actually the absolutes of thought, of which then mean thought is unfolding, and it can only do that in relation with us. We become actually a mechanism of that unfolding. So far from the subject getting in the way of thought, as Kant is putting forth, actually the subject is necessary for thought, because, and Clayton, wonderful to have you, sir, because the limit of thought is what thought requires to develop, and that limit is there because of the presence of the subject that is making it unfold. So far from the subject actually getting rid or keeping us from the noumenal, if you will, and that the unrepresentable is a problem, the unrepresentable is precisely thought being itself as it unfolds into greater represent, which of course ontologizes lack. That means lack is ontological. And if you don't do that, you get into trouble. I have more, but the heart and body I completely agree with. I think there is also, once you get into the less finished works of Hegel on nature, the encyclopedia, there are giant suggestions, I do think, that basically the movement of thought is actually isomorphic with the movement of reality itself, that if you think thought according to itself, you actually align with how things are, but you only do that from a gestalt, which means you do absolutely have to bring in the heart. You absolutely have to bring that in, because once you're reconciled with limit, there's a way in which you love it. Like, you love it. You actually are glad for it. You find joy in it, right? And so the heart, in that very way, the only way to go from understanding to reason as a reconciliation with the unfolding is necessarily a certain coming together of mind and heart. I think that absolutely goes together, but I will pause and throw it to Daniel here.
This is so wonderful. Just first, Thomas, I saw the title of the Substack that you wrote, and I've been waiting for a chance to get added. The heart and Aristotle, it's really, I'm very thankful that you did that and that you said what you said now. Okay, I want to bring back in, or maybe riff on limits, contradiction, and the possible other words, linking that with this what Thomas was beginning to articulate with the place of the heart, or the function of the heart, or what the heart is. Maybe that's the the best kind of question in, like, what is the heart? I brought in this idea of universal egoity. I think it's coming from like a Kashmir Shaivism. The idea is something like the absolute is the unique signature of each thing that is. So the absolute is the unique self. The uniqueness, so similar to what Thomas was saying about the way that something presents itself to the eyes of the one to whom it presents. And there's something that's particular, singular about that encounter. I think the position with the universal egoity is that the uniqueness is the reality, or is the absolute. So this is why I was relating to this notion of contradiction, but wondering if that saying universal egoity for the last time, I hope, is speaking to the same reality. It's interesting also that the Kashmir Shaivism is coming with a similar triadic structure, or a trinity. Then now I'm going to be I guess wondering, speculating. And Daniel, I appreciate the way you were responding to me in gesture the last time I was wandering around. It was very supportive. So I appreciate that. Okay, so contradiction, taking that as like we are beings who speak. We speak from a particular locus, ideally from our heart, from the uniqueness that we are, and we say, I am this wada wada wada, or I am yada yada, and there's like the locus of enunciation, or the place from which the speech act says. And it almost says itself in like such absolute terms, I am. But immediately, as the site of saying, is obviously not the absolute. So like the very speaking being is the contradiction, in the sense of dictating from an opposing position within reality. Like the speech act is contradicting reality. I guess I wonder that it's so interesting in this area, like the function of philosophy, or the way that we do philosophy. So like in a different kind of setup, there would be maybe you'd communicate like the triadic heart of being. Like being has this triadic heart, and it's almost like maybe I'm just saying what Thomas said, like it's an artifact, or there's like an art to it, or you encounter an art, or like the philosophy, something that you encounter that is meant to help you cognize or recognize something. The last thing I'll say, really wondering about what the heart is, and what its functioning, what its functioning is, and then what that means for I don't know, practice, for philosophical practice. And this, I think, is now like speaking about the tradition of reading in philosophy. Like you go, what is the philosophical activity of sitting? From an understanding of reality, like sitting still. How do we? These are real differences in traditions. I mean, I'm just thinking more and more about the opportunities of fruitful comparison. Comparison often goes wrong, but Yeah, let me pass back.
I think that question on the heart is fantastic. And I think also, yeah. So yes, there's automatically a problem where, there's a certain, language is a failure. The word cat is not the phenomenon of cat. And a lot of, like, for me, the early work on reconstructing ASI was based on the language problem from Gorobowski. The map is not the territory. And yet the only way I know the territory is via a map. Therefore, I know by a certain contradiction. I know what a thing is by what it is not. That's a contradiction. And the ASA paper is based on the language problem. So, but then there's also a question. If the only way to know the territory is by a map, then is it really a contradiction or is it a precondition? Like, it's just the way of reality is such that the only way to know things is by knowing them by what they are not, right? So what you realize is contradiction is actually a revelation that reality is not what you thought it was, actually. Like, you think reality is stable identity. That's been the movement of philosophy. Kant, getting at what things are, the analytical project. No. Reality is a knowing by what it isn't. Like, that is a essential characteristic of reality. And so you can't say the lack of knowledge is a failure of reality. It is actually part of reality. It is the movement of reality. Because this is where in Hegel now it's all movement. Because the only way you can make sense of this is to be like, well, the lack of is part of reality if reality is an unfolding. That's why the word unfolding becomes such a big deal, right? If it's a stable state, it's here, and the lack is over there, well, then it's over there and reality is here, so it's not part of reality. But if reality is actually an eminently unfolding realization and a creative realization, which starts pointing to a Whitehead, that's why I think many people will bring Hegel and Whitehead together. Well, then the lack of knowledge is actually just the movement of the thing into greater emergence of itself, you could say, right? So then contradiction is not a failure of, so then contradiction comes to know itself. And ultimately, this is why I always stress time space, because when contradiction comes to know itself, it knows itself as something more like time space. And then the $1 million move is if you say there is no possibility of a possible world that is space-time versus time-space, well, now we have necessity without a meta-law. Because that would be the counter to everything I've said, is you would say, hey, because the suggestion is there's no possible world that isn't time-space. Okay? Well, you say, well, that's false. There's a possible world that's space-time. Hegel will be like, nope, there isn't. There's not. You can't make a world that's space-time instead of time-space. Now, there could be infinite number of time-space worlds, but time-space is finitude. So the only world that wouldn't be time-space would be God, which isn't a world. And philosophy is interested in the question of necessity of world, right? So then Hegel's like, game. That's kind of the checkmate move, basically, is the move he wants to make, in my opinion. And then I'll throw it to Mr. Jockin here. I do have to unfold chairs. I only have like 3 weeks left. We're almost through the blitz. The move is saying there is no possible world that isn't time-space. Therefore, if you can come to know true things about time-space in being time-space, then you know that of which applies in all possible worlds. Infinitude to itself. Not because of a meta-law. Therefore, you get necessity without meta-law. And I know I keep coming back to that because that, I guess, I'm just responding to Luber's question at the beginning. Because for me, the question of the Heidegger-Hegel debate is ultimately that. The idea of, is it the case that Heidegger is ultimately presenting a meta-law, right? Or not? And if you say he is, then Hegel is superior to Heidegger. But if you say no, actually the later Heidegger is very much actually looking for necessity based on finitude itself, just like Hegel, well then it's all there together, right? But so the question is simply, do you buy this? Do you buy that every possible world has to be a time space? If you say no, then Hegel would be like, what's that based on? Like, how do you not? Because this is also the crazy move. You turn around and you say, well, I just don't believe that. Well, that's a presupposition. You're taking a you're the one with the presupposition then. You're saying that world, you're saying that it can't be the case that all possible worlds are time-space. That's a presupposition. So that's the move. Hegel's like, look, if we look at reality, that is this world in its unfolding, what we see is time space. Okay? So that's not a presupposition. That's based on inner supposition. That's based on the encounter of finitude with limit. That's finitude unfolding itself. It's not presupposition. It's intersuppositional, based on experience. Okay. So I'm now just going to claim that all possible worlds are time space. And it's not, and it's not presupposition. It's based on reality. I could even just say that this is the only possible world, actually, that there is no multiverse. Like the moment you say there, because also modal logic is not about a multiverse. It's about all possible formulations of this world, right? And it'd be like, all possible formulations of this world is time space. And based on how that unfolds, we can arrive at necessity. I know I keep saying that. The interesting thing is then, what is this knowledge of the heart, actually? And this is where I think Heidegger is very interesting and actually gets at it. Every single person has a different thing that comes before the eyes. And being is precisely that of which is unveiled through the multiplicity of all the ways that things come before the eyes. Far from this is the later, in my opinion, later Heidegger move. Far from the multiplicity meaning that we can't get at being. The multiplicity is being giving itself. That is how being is. Being is the harmony of the multiplicity. It is all of the ways that come before the eyes. And every single person has a role in being itself and having a unique way that being comes before the eyes. And that unique way is also tied to the creative act of how being uniquely unfolds, that it could not uniquely unfold in any other way without the multiplicity of all the ways it comes before the eyes. So far from subjectivity getting in the way of being, it is actually the means of the unfolding of being. It is actually the unfolding of time-space is the relation of the subject with being, that in having that different experience of how things come before the eyes, actually being then unfolds differently, if you will, and more creatively. And so in that sense, the heart actually becomes the ontological participation of being to itself that makes it disclose itself in a unique way of every individual. So the heart then is ontological in that sense, because and then your job is to trust it. Your job is to actually trust the things coming before your eyes, or the way the things comes before your eyes, and to believe in pursuing that. If Aristotle comes before your eyes, if things apprehend before your eyes, see it through until you hit the limit, until you hit the things you don't understand. Be the problem. The coming before the eyes is then the call on the unique way that in you, being is going to manifest uniquely at this moment of history so that it can unfold in the way that being gives itself to be unfolded. That can only be unfolded because of the possibility of unique ways of being coming before eyes differently. That if being did not come before eyes differently, there would be one way that being could be unveiled. Do you understand? And so there would be one possible world. But this is the move. The one possible world is actually in itself containing the multiplicity of many possible worlds according to each individual in itself as a monad. So now you have a monad, you have a single substance, if you will, a single metageometry that actually, because of the involvement of subjectivity, entails the possibility of infinite unfoldings. And yet it does not become chaos because of the heart. The heart is how you get the many in the one in this way. The heart is how you get the many in the one in the metageometry itself. And thus the subject, far from getting in the way of real knowledge, is actually ontologically necessary for the unfolding. So to me, that's where nous becomes such big. And it also then points to Bergson's intuition, ultimately, which is ontological. But I will throw it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
I'm glad you're picking up this bringing before the eyes point, because actually it's one of my most important, it's one of Aristotle's most important concepts that only the rhetoricians know, because this is from rhetoric. I think that's also a very important aspect. It's in the rhetoric bringing before the eyes generally shows up, or most commonly is known. It's a little bit in some of his other works, like the Anima and Memory and Recollection, but its most explicit definition and explanation is in the rhetoric, which is very important on two grounds. One, because rhetoric is the persuasion, it's basically the motion of persuasion of probable situations, right? So actually, in terms of working in communities and relationships of response to possibility, rhetoric is one of the method Aristotle talks about rhetoric, is that is very important. And why is that? this next step. So what bringing before the eyes does is, this is Aristotle's language. It reveals the energeia of this is that. A is B. You're going to play with your language, Daniel. So that's what bring before the eyes does. It reveals a reality of energeia. And for Aristotle, that's like the magic word. You see that word energeia, it's you stop everything because you go, wait a minute. Why in rhetoric is energeia being discussed? And how is that possible in speech? Of exactly what you're saying, in unlikeness, in total unlikeness, and just figures of arrangement, we reveal new realities of actuality. That is phenomenal. And actually, the notes related to here, in terms of, again, Daniel's question on what is the heart, at the heart of the matter, haha, what I just did there, is essence. No, really, it's essence. And a couple of notes. One is, and tradition has been talked about many different ways, and beauty has a direct relationship to this on a couple of grounds. One, Ecclesiastes. Everything's beautiful in a time. God also put eternity in the heart of men. Right? I think it's from book 3. I had that in my heart, that passage, because it really captures a very important aspect of this. That thus this idea of time with the heart is very attached to each other, and then beauty too with this too. I think surprise is a very important aspect of this as well. Surprise is actually that whole encounter of surprise is the whole demonstration of new possibility, right? And actually where knowledge shows up. So actually your articulation, Daniel, of it's in the contradiction when knowledge fails that it's actually possible that something new can come out of it, like things can come out of it. It's because of surprise, which is quantifiable. We know, and actually that's fun thing is that surprise can be measured, which is amazing. I think the other note is it's partly, again, I bet my understanding of Hegel has been that he's kind of collapsed nous with spirit, but it's actually talking through this. We see the separation in Aristotle because, and this is very important. This is the problem is when you're naive in Aristotle and you go to metaphysics and you find out, oh, nous is God. Oh, we have nous, therefore we're God. Like it's that trip up. Everyone scrambles because we're like, well, no, that's not what Aristotle means. Well, if we just had absolute activity of nous, we would be God. And there's actually lots of argumentation on this point. The subtle detail is that we're spirit too. And yes, God is spirit too, theological counts, yes. But the point is, like, there's a distinction. It's too long to go winded about talking through this. I still need to think through it myself, but a little bit more. But the point is, like, this operation of the heart to apprehend by bring before the eyes of reality of an encounter of an experience drives. I'm going to give you the example of my work with Aristotle and beauty and Plato and beauty. Beauty was there this whole time, guys. It's all there. The scholars knew about it, but no one wanted to, like, the obfuscation is wild. So it took me to go through the readings and go, wait a minute, this beauty thing is all over the place. And it's actually one of the hermeneutics. And then, by the way, to make it stronger, I had to use health. Again, health is everywhere in these texts. So you see, again, it's like, what's going on here? Something of an insight of a essence drawn out to me. And then I hunted it down with dialectic and speculative reasoning to come up to, and then get a new understanding, a new apprehension that I'm able to share with others. And then they go, oh, wait a minute, it was there the whole time. So therefore, does the Thomas Jockin have to be here to talk about when Aristotle already wrote about health or beauty, for example, or Plato? The answer is one sentence, no, he didn't. He was there the whole time. But within this community, it took me talking about it for you all to see it, what I saw. And I think that's a really particular point. Now, last thing I want to say is a note I talked about before about exemplars. Because the whole point of when the subject is the predicate, it explodes. Aristotle has this. It is an explosion of infinity. And that explosion of infinity is thought to be, is to point out that the explosion of the infinity is to point out that when the individual is a universal. So, for example, when we say Floyd Mayweather is boxing, so actually even more particular, I could do beyond that, a tautology of saying Floyd Mayweather is Floyd Mayweather, right? There's like that kind of explosion, but there's also the kind when we say the person is the example, is the principle, and reveals the whole intelligibility of a whole concept or a whole domain of reality. There's something about that in terms of something excessive of the individual, right? When they reach this point, and I do think the relationships with those individuals almost always have been some have relations with the heart because they're going beyond the accounts of the time. They're adding something new. How is that possible? That's possible because they're in contact to the essence of things and can reveal a new possibility. Usually by sitting in the girdle, quote you, Daniel, sitting in the girdle point, knowing the limit of their maps. They went to the map all the way through to the limit to the end, saw the edge of it, and then pursued further. And that kind of, I think the big thing is, and I've talked with, I believe Luber was on the call because I talked with this with them and Javier. What proportionate analogy gives you is instead of a dialectic about contraries, kind of fighting, like kind of oscillating off each other, just off itself, the four terms of the relationships reveal a fifth that was not seen before. It takes the heart, which brings brought before the eyes of the relationship of the parts to the other parts and how they interrelate with each other. And they reveal a new, surprising reality. This is what exemplars always do. They're always relating, they're oscillating off the limitations, constraints, bios, limitations of an encounter in time, in a discourse, in a limit, working through that and revealing a new possibility. The very fact that enigate is never defined by Aristotle, he doesn't give you a definition. He gives you an analogy proportion to talk through. And it has an appearance of dialectics. It does seem like that what he's doing is a little bit of that. But because of the relationships of four he's doing almost always, it reveals, is drawing the image to you of what is enegeia by doing that. That's all I have.
No, well, again, I think for me that gets into the speculative reason from the dialectic, and when that is missed, then you just get this back and forth that doesn't go anywhere, and it becomes very problematic. But what I was going to say, so if the mind arrives at, so the mind can create generalities, and I do unfortunately have this wedding. I have an early tour. If the mind can arrive at generalities, the question is the following. I'll just call it the fifth. I'll just call what you described the fifth. Is the fifth a generality? No, it's different, and yet it has some sort of abstract application. Well, this is interesting. So the heart is able to create the fifth, but the mind can only generate generalities. A generality like cat is not the same as the fifth or a fifth. Right? But what's very odd is a fifth, in a sense, can be more generally applied because once you arrive at that proportional analogy, that gives you an understanding that can open up new horizons beyond, right? Those four, it goes beyond. So there's a certain beyondness that the fifth gives you. But does a generality give you a beyond? If I look at four particular cats and learn about the general category of cat, does that give me a beyond? Kind of, but actually it reduces the beyond because now I know whatever this thing is when I encounter it, right? It's actually shrinking the world in a way, right? There's a way in which a generality shrinks the world, okay? Whereas the fifth opens the world, right? Being is a process of knowing itself according to fifths, not generalities. And that requires subjects that undergo unique ways by which things come before the eyes. So being is the process of knowing itself, not according to the mind, a generality, but the fullness of the person that is the apprehending of the fifth that is unique for each individual, like you're saying. Because like you're saying with health, imagine a world where Thomas Jockin doesn't exist and health never comes forth. Then being never knows, it never knows that. It never picks up on health in Aristotle. It's always there, but it never knows. Being never knows what was always in being, okay? Like this is the Heidegger idea, like the later Heidegger, is that being does not actually know fully what it contains. And I think that's also Hegelian. Like it doesn't actually know what it already contains. It doesn't know that it already contains this understanding of health in Aristotle, right? So the subject plays the role of helping being come to realize what was always already latent in it. That if it was never realized, it would be as if it was never latent in it. That's also the crazy move. If no one is ever born, that makes one realize health in Aristotle. It's as if health isn't in Aristotle, even though it is. Relative to being, in a sense, it's not. And is at the same time. That's always that weird bothness going on, right? The moment it comes before the eyes of a Thomas Jockin, then that means actually being can know itself according to that, and then it spreads, right? And then more people can know it. Of which then in people knowing changes how they act and behave, that changes how being can know itself and what comes before their eyes. And that being is that ever process, all of which is contained, that becoming, because that's the proper understanding of becoming as this, the way the subject is involved in the becoming of time space as a creative act. It is the subject makes possible the fifth, of which then changes how subjects act, which changes how being unfolds, which changes what then therefore can come before the eyes of subjects, on and on and on and on. But the key way that being knows itself is via the fifth, not generality, not the mind. That's the mistake of when you have the dream of the enlightenment, the dream of autonomous rationality, is actually the way being knows itself is via rational process, of which always at best is generality. And like that's all rationality can give you. It can give you nothing definitive. It can give you nothing radically particular, right? And the weird thing that happens in the fifth is it is an insight that is only knowable in a radical intimacy with particularities that then gives you something that you can bring to other particularities without making them general, without making them abstraction, that honors them in their definitive particularity, of which makes possible another fifth coming forth, another thing being apprehended that then can be brought. And it is this process of bringing of fifths to other particularities that is the process of being knowing itself and being led to be and created by the subject. And that is the Gödel gestalt unfolding as time space. And the argument is that there is no possible world in which being is not such, and therefore you can arrive at necessity without meta law. That would be the argument. And if you say you do not buy that, then you have a presupposition, and therefore who's in the wrong? I appreciate everything that everyone is saying. I do have to run now.